you'll be able to get this recording on the same website listed on the slide. So Amanda, over to you.
So help me remember. I know I re-quoted the job. 1 minute and 2 minutes.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. If everyone could please ensure they have the mute button pushed. I'll wait just a second.
All right.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon again. We are very excited. Colonel Kimball is our very first webinar presenter. We do plan on continuing to do these on a monthly basis, so please look for the future ones. But for now, I am very excited to introduce you to Colonel Ray Kimball. He is a career U.S. Army officer with over 20 years of service to the nation, including overseas tours in Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and East Africa. Over the course of his career, he has served as a helicopter pilot, a history instructor, a strategic advisor, and a White House staffer. His academic credentials include master's degrees in history and Russian area studies from Stanford and his doctorate of education in learning technologies from Pepperdine. He currently serves as the director of the Center for Junior Officers at the United States Military Academy, West Point, New York. Sir, with that introduction, we are very excited to have you, and the floor is yours.
Amanda, thank you very much. It is really a great honor to be here today with this group. Certainly, I have learned so much from my interaction with my enlisted folks over the years, and so it is a great honor, really, for me to be here with this group and sharing some of what I've discovered and what I've found out about mentoring over the years. I do want to reiterate Kathy's point. I really prefer that this be interactive, so please feel free to fire away with questions in the chat box as we go along. There will be times when I'll put out ideas for thought, ideas for comment, and please feel free to respond in the chat box on those as well. I promise I don't judge spelling, so just please jump on in with your thoughts as we go. And like I said, it really is a great honor for me to get to talk about this. I started studying military mentoring about 6 years ago as part of my doctoral dissertation. And my initial studies were on officer mentoring, and I originally shied away from looking at enlisted mentoring because I felt like I didn't have the background, and I felt like I didn't have the practical expertise to really be able to speak about it. And in engaging with some folks, they convinced me that that was frankly a cop-out, and that I needed to get off my duff and actually do some research on it. And so I've done that recently, and so it's really a great pleasure to be able to talk with you about it here today. When we're talking about mentoring, it's important first off to really make sure that we're all using the same terminology, because there does tend to be some confusion at times. There does tend to be some differences of opinion about what terms mean. So I want to start just by defining my terms so that everybody understands what I'm referring to. You can see the definitions that I'm using up there on the screen. The primary thing that I would emphasize on mentoring is that mentoring relationships first and foremost are voluntary. There is no such thing as mandatory mentoring. There can certainly be mandatory meetings where people are encouraged to seek out mentors. There can certainly be mandatory points in someone's career where people are encouraged to think about a mentor at that particular time. But when we're talking about the actual formation of the relationships, when we're talking about the actual conduct of the relationships, mentoring by definition is voluntary. If you're talking about something that's compulsory, you're talking about another form of individualized professional development. And I'll get into some of those options a little bit later. The other key aspect of a mentoring relationship is that it is mutually beneficial. A relationship where only one person is getting all of the benefits is not a mentoring relationship, despite the kind of a popular conception that the junior person gets all the benefits of a mentoring relationship. Far from it. Real true mentoring relationships, both the senior and the junior person in the relationship get benefits out of that relationship. So what does that mean in terms of a mentor and a protege? Well, what it really means is that the only difference between a mentor and a protege is their level of experience, not their rank, not their age, not their position, although certainly all of those can potentially serve as initial proxies for judging a differing level of experience. But the only thing that differentiates a mentor from a protege in a mentoring relationship is their level of experience. Now, let me talk about one other thing, which is the use of the term protege. This is a subject of great debate in the mentoring research community. You'll hear some folks that prefer protege. You'll hear some folks that prefer mentee. I prefer the term protege. I dislike the term mentee because mentee sounds like something that someone is done to, right? It sounds like someone that is on the receiving end of things. And as I already mentioned, mentoring relationships are by definition mutual. So that's why I'll use the term protege throughout this, but if you're more comfortable with the term mentee, certainly feel free to substitute in mentee for protege whenever I talk about it. So let's talk a little bit about why military mentoring matters. Don't feel bad, but I'm just curious, and you sound off in the chat box. Does anybody on the webinar recognize the picture that is up on the screen right now?
We got something in the chat box. No, nobody seems to recognize who it is.
And don't feel bad if you don't. I have given variations on this presentation a couple of different times over the years, and even when I was presenting to a room full of military historians, the majority of the people didn't recognize that individual. So you probably don't recognize him, but I'm pretty sure that you recognize the three other individuals that I just put up on the screen, specifically George Marshall, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and George Patton. And so let me tell you how these men all relate to one another. The individual there on the left is Colonel Fox Connor. And Fox Connor is the most important American military officer that you've never, ever heard of, because Fox Connor played a critical role in the development of all three of these other individuals. So let me take them one by one. During World War I, George Marshall was a young lieutenant on the Allied Expeditionary Force staff, and he was the assistant to the assistant to the assistant staff officer, kind of languishing away, turning the crank on staff actions. As Connor was going through a tour of the headquarters one day, Marshall came up to Connor and made a pitch to him, totally out of the blue. Brand new lieutenant, making a pitch to who was at that time a lieutenant colonel, and Connor could have easily shoved him to the side. Instead, Connor recognized that what Marshall was saying made sense, and not only got his policy implemented, but personally pulled him up to serve on General Pershing's staff. As a result of that, and as a result of getting seen at those higher levels, Marshall's career began the trajectory that it would eventually culminate in him becoming the Chief of Staff of the Army. Likewise with George Patton. After World War I is over, then Captain George Patton is searching around, trying to figure out what he's going to do after the war, and he runs into Fox Connor. And Fox Connor says, "Hey, Patton, there are these things called tanks. They're brand new. We don't really know what they can do. We're not really even sure how to maintain them or how to employ them, but we think there's potential in them, and I think it'd be a great career path. Why don't you go check it out?" Well, Patton does, in fact, go check out these crazy thing called tanks, and the rest is history. He becomes the father of the American Armored Force. Finally, Eisenhower. In the mid-1920s, Eisenhower is a career officer whose career is going nowhere. He is thoroughly sick and fed up with military life, and the final straw that is going to break the camel's back is when Eisenhower gets told that he's going to Panama for a year, and he has to leave his family behind. And so Eisenhower says, "That's it, I'm done. Once I'm finished with this Panama tour, I am out of the Army." Well, he goes to Panama and he works for Fox Connor. And right away, Fox Connor recognizes that there is potential in Eisenhower that nobody has seen yet. So he introduces Eisenhower to the ideas of professional learning and professional mentorship. He introduces Eisenhower to his personal library that Connor shipped over to Panama at his own expense. Something like 2,000 pounds of military readings drawn from authors all over the world. And Connor is really the one who lights the fire of professional learning in Eisenhower. And Eisenhower writes later in his memoirs that his year with Fox Connor was the most consequential year that he ever spent in the Army in terms of his professional development. So when we talk about military mentoring, this just gives you a sense of what the influence that one individual can have on many, many careers and the impact that they can have going forward. Now, when we talk about actual mentoring practices and we talk about who does mentoring, we've got a little bit of data to support that. The data that I'm showing on this slide is from the Army. I've tried to do some research. I've tried to do some digging on mentoring percentages in other services and have not had a whole lot of luck. So certainly, if there are folks who can recommend resources to that effect, I am all ears because I'm always looking to expand my knowledge sources. But as you can see, about half of enlisted soldiers in the ranks of E5 through E9 reported that they currently receive mentoring. And as we talk about the soldiers who mentor, that number goes up from about 58% for junior non-commissioned officers, E5 and E6, to 73% for senior non-commissioned officers, E7 through E9. And this is what we would expect, right? The more senior a person is, the more likely it is that they would serve as mentors, I should say. But then if you look over and look at the impact that they had on it, the impact is very similar. 82% of both groups said that mentoring had a large or a great impact in their development. So over 3/4. So clearly significant. When people were asked about who their mentors were, there were a variety of different sources. The single biggest contributor to mentoring was someone who was their immediate supervisor, or their immediate superior, or their supervisor. 20% of all respondents across the Army who responded to the survey said that their mentor was their immediate superior or supervisor. For E5s and E6s, that number was much higher. It was 38%. Then others said that it was either another soldier or a civilian in their unit or chain of command. That was another 19%. Other options that folks could have selected included soldiers and civilians who were not in the unit or chain of command, or folks completely outside of the Army as a whole. One really interesting difference is in the frequency of interaction between different categories. As you can see there, E5s and E6s were more likely to report that their interaction with their mentors or their proteges was weekly or more often, which is similar to what was reported for junior officers, 01s through 03s. But for more senior officers, 04 through 06, they tended to have mentoring interactions less frequently, monthly or quarterly. So depending on where you fall in this population, your frequency of mentoring, how often you engage, how often you work with people, that frequency may well differ. So what I want to move into now is some of the actual observed practices and some of the things that I've seen. And it would be really helpful, and I would love to hear from folks. I'm going to pose questions as we go along, and once again, I would love to hear feedback in the chat box about what your thoughts are on this. And then once I've gotten your thoughts, I'll share my findings, and that way we can all kind of learn from one another. So the first question that I want to pose to the group is enlisted mentoring different? And what I mean by that is it different from what you've seen officers do? Is it different from what you've seen civilians do? What's been your experience in that regard? Interesting. So more hands-on, okay. Significant differences due to culture. Sure, that makes sense. I think that's I think those are both fantastic observations. And those jibe to some extent with what I found. And by the way, folks, please continue to chime in. So a differing observation, mentoring is mentoring, meets them where they're at given the mentor's capability. So some differing perceptions here. What I found in my interviews with non-commissioned officers was that they felt that NCO mentoring, at least in the Army, was not as extensive or well-developed as officer mentoring. They felt like officers had more opportunities to find a mentor, to find a protege. They felt like officers were more overtly encouraged to seek out a mentor, to seek a protege, and to identify themselves as ready for either of those roles. One of the NCOs really described it as hit or miss, and he said that when it did happen, it tended to be more focused on senior non-commissioned officers rather than on junior NCOs or even junior enlisted. And so along with the slides, you'll see on some of these slides quotes from my participants, and these are their contributions. These are their actual thoughts. I haven't paraphrased them. I haven't changed them. These are their actual words. And what Samuel told me was that he felt like, going to Chris's comment about culture, that he felt like it was a culture challenge specifically about young non-commissioned officers not wanting to seem inferior. They didn't want to be seen as asking for help, as putting themselves out there. Instead, that they were encouraged to just be internal and manage this internally themselves. So I talked before about what is mentoring and what isn't mentoring. So the next question that I'd like to throw out there to folks is, when do you see yourself coaching and when do you see yourself mentoring? And that can be either giving coaching and mentoring or receiving coaching and mentoring. How do you differentiate between those two? And if you've never thought about the difference between the two and don't see a difference, that's totally fine too. You can chime in with that. Okay, so Karen's comment, the coach is more on specific tasks and mentoring is long run. Absolutely, I hear that a lot. Chris talking about mentoring more of sharing experiences while offline, coaching, driving behavior during the mission. Coaching may require a boot, but mentoring wouldn't. That's a great way of putting it, Chris. And John's comment, coaching, developing a skill that the person knows but needs development. Mentoring, developing new skills that haven't been experienced yet. Okay, interesting. Yeah, so some great observations there. For some of you who may feel confused about, wow, I've never really differentiated between that, I will tell you that you're not alone. A colleague of mine, Lila Kohestani, who runs an organization called Promote Leadership that advocates for mentoring for minority populations in military formations. She sums this up really well. Don's comment, using questions to get a mentee to think into a situation, mentoring, sharing experiences. She has a really great comment. She has a really great term for this. She calls it the coach-teach-mentor phenomenon, which is that anytime we talk about individual professional development, we always talk about those three words, coaching, teaching, and mentoring, and we always use them together, and we never really differentiate between them. And I think that's fair, and that matches my own experience, that a lot of times folks don't really differentiate between them. And it is important that we differentiate between them because they are very separate and distinct skills, and there's times when each of them are appropriate. The easiest way that I have found to really sort out the difference between counseling, coaching, and mentoring is this a one-way or a two-way relationship? Is knowledge flowing both ways, or is knowledge only flowing one way? If knowledge is only flowing one way, I would argue that you're probably doing counseling or coaching rather than mentoring. Whereas if you've got knowledge flowing in both directions, if both individuals are learning from one another, then it's more likely to be a mentoring relationship. In terms of differentiating between counseling and coaching, counseling typically tends to be mandatory. It typically tends to be driven by outside sources, whereas coaching is often more optional. Now, that being said, there can be some blurring of the lines here. One of the things that's really interesting about modern communications is that it really blurs the line between these, so that you can. There was a comment earlier about long-term versus short-term. Now, with persistent communications, now you can have a long-term coach that you are learning from, but that maybe that coach isn't necessarily learning anything from you, even though you're engaging over the long term. So the argument there would be that that's a coaching relationship rather than a mentoring relationship. Brandy has a really great point here. Mentoring of giving them the tools, and coaching is more relaxed, seeing how they operate with the tools and giving them a helping hand. I think that can be a great way to illustrate it as well. You can see the comment here from James about that it really is about the individual person and the individual situation, trying to motivate them, trying to encourage them, showing what they need to do in order to achieve their goals. But it really, again, comes down to knowing the individual, knowing what they want, knowing what they need, and helping them to figure it out. Now, on this next question, the question of can supervisors be mentors? I've already obviously shown my hand a little bit on this when I talked about the survey data, but I'm curious to hear what this audience thinks about, I'm curious to hear what this audience thinks in reference to can supervisors be mentors. An interesting comment from Kathy here that she passed along: officers are mentored to become commanders, enlisted are mentored to take the next job, referring back to our earlier discussion on differences between officer and enlisted mentoring. I think that's a great point. But the central question right now that I want to focus in on is, what do you think about supervisors being mentors? Is that a realistic expectation? Is that something that should be the norm? What has been the experience of folks with that respect? Okay, so Ree's comment, supervisors are coaches most of the time. Don, anyone can be a mentor, depends on the topic, but it has to be productive. It was great observations. Chris's comment, they can certainly mentor, but the outcome may be different as the protege may be more guarded. Aaron, I do like outside mentoring as it gives a different view, perhaps from someone outside the career field. John's comment, I've developed mentoring relationships through being someone's subordinate of them being mine, lasted until after the supervisory relationship ended. All of those are fantastic points. A really great point from Brandy. Not every supervisor knows what they're doing. I think we've all been there, but a mentee can still learn from them. Fantastic points. I will tell you that for me, this was a point that I struggled with when I started doing mentoring research, because I felt very firmly that because mentoring is by definition voluntary and mutual, well, in the military we don't get to pick our supervisors, right? They get assigned, they get appointed. We don't get that choice. So I was really struggling to see how a supervisor could be a mentor when you didn't have any choice in them coming into that position. But I was very quickly turned around when I started speaking with my participants, and every single one of them, both my officer and my NCO study participants, had either had mentors who were supervisors or had served as a mentor for somebody who they were the supervisor. And even after I pushed back and made the points about voluntary and mutual, they pushed back and said, no, there was something different about these particular relationships. There was something special and unique that went over and above what you typically expected of supervisors. And that, I think, is really the key thing here. We certainly shouldn't expect every supervisor to be a mentor to every one of their subordinates. Mentoring is an enormous investment of time. It's an enormous investment of effort. And it also requires just a resonance, a chemistry between those two individuals in order to resonate. One of the comments made earlier about getting mentoring outside of your career field, you may have subordinates who want to go in an entirely different career field than what you've gone, and so you may not necessarily be the best mentor for them as their supervisor. One of the other things that folks really emphasized when they talked about chain of command mentoring or supervisory mentoring was that they really had to be aware of how that supervisory mentoring could lead to perceptions of favoritism. And they really had to be very deliberate in making sure that all of their subordinates, regardless of whether they had that mentoring relationship, had opportunities for individual development, had opportunities for growth, even if those weren't through the supervisor individual. individually. And Wyatt, I think, really nails this down of knowing that you can't force a mentor-protege relationship. In order to call it a mentor relationship, you've got to have the right chemistry. You can have any number of good leaders, but people are going to be drawn to a certain style or a certain kind of person. So what about peers? So we've talked about supervisors as mentors. We've talked about that the only difference between a mentor and a protege is the difference in experience. So what does that mean for peers being a mentor? Can someone who is your same rank, your same position, can they be a mentor, or can you be a mentor to them? So Aaron, I would say so. Kathy brings up a great point. Could competition get in the way? Got a strong absolutely from Ree. So this is an area where there really were mixed opinions on this. Karen says, yes, different people have different strengths. I apologize, the name is cut off. Aaron comments, I think you don't have to be a full-time mentor. You can be a mentor in a situation. Okay, yeah, really, really interesting point. This was an area where there was a big divide in both the officers and in the NCOs that I surveyed. About half of each said, yes, peers can be mentors, and the other half said, no, I don't think peers can be mentors. So talking about the negatives first, one of the things that came up routinely was the point that Kathy brought out, that because you are competing for the same positions, you're competing for the same assignments, you're potentially competing for what we call box checks about where you're ranked in an evaluation population, that can be a real inhibitor to peer mentoring, because folks see them as in competition with one another. And so for folks who felt that peer mentoring, in the military did not exist, that was what they typically cited. Don brings out a great point. Mentoring, it's not about rank, it's about experience. Brandy emphasizes you need someone to tell you about yourself, who can relate to you in the circumstances. My NCOs, when they talked about peer mentoring, they felt that it was less frequent than officers. I think that's a function of the cultural aspect that we talked about earlier on. And they saw peer mentoring as being driven more by specific needs than by being attracted to a particular person to serve as a mentor. So NCOs would talk about needing to get a particular set of expertise on something. They would reach out to someone, and by seeking out that expertise, they formed a lasting relationship that led to expansion of experiences in other areas. And this relates to a similar form of mentoring that we call networked mentoring. And networked mentoring is nothing more than the idea that you can have more than one mentor or more than one protege at a time. And one of the most effective things that you can do is actually reach out to that network when you have a challenge. You can reach out to that group and pulse people on the same topic and get different feedback and get different people ideas, different ideas. Joe has a question, does this include informal and formal mentoring relationships? It absolutely does. And since we brought out those terms, I think it's worth defining them as well real quick. Generally speaking, informal mentoring is a mentoring match where the match is totally organic. It's just made by two people coming together and saying, yep, I want to be a mentor, I want to be a protege, we work well together, let's do this. Formal mentoring relationships are ones where the match is facilitated by outside mechanisms. Maybe there's a database where people can go and where the command has people enter in their characteristics, and then people make matches that way. Again, I want to emphasize in both informal and formal mentoring, the choice to enter into the actual relationship is solely driven by the mentor and by the protege, not by those outside forces. So formal mentoring is being facilitated by outside forces, whereas informal mentoring, they're just simply forming on their own. Joe, let me know if I answered your question on that. So I was talking about network mentoring and the fact that you can reach out to this network and you can get all of these different perspectives. One of the really interesting things about peer mentoring is the idea that it can lead to a flipping of roles between mentor and protege, and we call this phenomenon mutuality. And what it means is because peers are so close in terms of experience, you can have a phenomenon where when you're talking about one particular set of experiences, One person serves as the mentor and one person serves as the protege. But when you move on to another set of experiences, they can actually flip those roles because that other individual, the one who was serving as the protege, now becomes the mentor because they are more capable and more experienced in that area. So certainly when we're talking about peer mentoring, the actual roles of mentor and protege are less firm and less fixed. They tend to be much more fluid. You can see Evan's comment that for him, peer mentoring was really important to him because he had trust in people to the left and right of him to really let himself be open and seek that kind of development. And it wasn't that he didn't trust the people above him, it's just that those folks didn't have the experience that he particularly felt that he needed, whereas folks and peers had that experience and had really what he was looking for. So we've talked about mentoring with supervisors, we've talked about mentoring with peers. Now let's talk about mentoring across identities. And by across identities, some of the different areas that we can potentially address are mentoring across ethnicities, mentoring across genders, and mentoring across ranks. And specifically here, I mean mentoring between the enlisted and officer ranks. So I would love to hear experiences from folks on what your experience has been on any of these mentoring across identities. Brandy says difficult topic. Yeah, absolutely. You know, in the military, we're really encouraged to not play up these different identities, and so it can be difficult to bring it out. Don, as second lieutenant, I had several master sergeants mentor me. Kathy, I think more junior officers need to be mentored by NCOs. Aaron, as a first sergeant, I've learned a lot from my commander as an intel officer, looks at things different ways, see things I wouldn't thought of. Chris, the only requirement to be a mentor is that you have more experience. It can come from anyone. God bless you, Chris. You've been listening from the beginning. I appreciate it. Karen, if you're a woman, it's easier to find a male mentor because not enough women at high level serve as mentors. Not enough women are available to serve. As a captain, I had Don. As a captain, I had black master sergeants mentor me. Don, I had females mentor me. John, I found as a young officer, I've been mentored more by NCOs than the other way around as I've grown more senior. So this is fantastic. Thanks to everybody for sharing, and by all means, feel free to keep putting them in the box, and I'll call them out as they come. I've been a mentor to a minority, now mentoring a person who worked on the client side. They're growing in their role as a leader and in business development. It's been interesting, and we're learning a ton from one another. I'm so happy to hear that. That's really, really exciting. So it is really fascinating looking at this question of mentoring across identities and how these different identities impact mentoring formation. What I found in talking with my participants was that when we talked about cross-ethnic relationships, that there tended to be relatively little difference between people who were mentoring or being mentored by someone of their same ethnicity and someone who was mentoring across ethnicities. And I think the reason for that is the overall culture of equal opportunity in the military. And I think Kathy's quote really nails this well of, hey, my criteria for mentors doesn't have anything to do with ethnicity. It's about if you're driven. What are your goals? Are you looking for the same thing I'm doing? Do we have the same values? I want to learn from people who have drive. And that was pretty typical of what I heard from folks. There were one or two folks who indicated that being a similar ethnicity and being a minority ethnicity helped them initially make connections, make mentoring connections, but that they didn't see their practice as being any different. The same cannot be true of mentoring across genders. For both officers and NCOs when I spoke to, they talked about significant differences in cross-gender relationships and in how those form. The single biggest differentiator of whether somebody had cross-gender mentoring relationships to begin with for the Army was whether or not they served in the combat arms or not. Because up until very recently, there haven't been women in combat arms units. And so those opportunities were just not there for them to mentor across gender lines. Now that we've opened up MOSs, now I think that's potentially going to change, but it's going to take a while for it to percolate through. One of the biggest inhibitors of cross-gender mentoring was cited as people perceiving or people being worried about the perception of a romantic relationship, which is understandable. Mentoring relationships, by definition, are intimate relationships, right? You are sharing parts of yourself with somebody else. You are sharing things that you don't normally share. Intimate does not mean romantic. The two are separate and distinct. If you move into a romantic relationship, I would argue now at this point, you're not mentoring anymore. That is entirely different. But there was great fear among people who practice cross-gender mentoring that that intimate relationship would be seen as crossing the line into a romantic relationship. In terms of mentoring across ranks, every single one of my NCO participants had an officer mentor or protege. But the vast majority of my officer participants did not have NCO mentors. So it was a really interesting difference there. Don's comment, the combat arms comment, depends upon mentor topics. They can talk leadership and management. Donna, I 100% agree. But and when folks shared to me that they didn't have, when males shared to me that they didn't have a female mentor, the issue was that they had just never had the opportunity to professionally engage with women extensively enough that they could actually get a sense of someone as a potential mentor or a potential protege. So it wasn't so much that they didn't feel like that they couldn't learn something, they just didn't have the sustained contact that's important in order to be able to develop that mentoring relationship. So great point, and I'm really glad that you brought that out. So I've given you a lot to chew on. I've put a lot out of here. I put a lot out here for you to kind of absorb. And so right now, the header of my slide is probably what some of you are thinking right now, which is cool story, bro, but what next? That's great that you've told me all these things. That's great that you've given me all these examples, but what can I actually do with all this? How can I actually get started on this? How can I actually put this into practice for my own mentoring relationships? And it's a very fair question, because starting down this path, finding a mentor, finding a protege can be really, really difficult if you've never done it before. So let me give you a couple of tips that I have found that I think work really, really well. The first is to look for mentoring spaces that are convenient to you. And I emphasize mentoring spaces rather than mentoring faces. We have this tendency to immediately want to jump to the mentoring faces aspect. I have to find the right person. I have to find the person with the right set of skills. And that's true. You have to find that individual, or else there can't be a relationship. The problem is, how do you get a sense of somebody in the first place, if they're a good fit for you, if they're a good match? And this is why I recommend people focus on mentoring spaces first. All a mentoring space is it's a place where you can get a better sense of someone as an individual. These may be formally set up locations. I know of commands that run what they call mentoring speed dating, which is where they get a bunch of people who volunteer to be both potential mentors and potential proteges, and they line up and they rotate through tables one by one for a minute, just sharing ideas with one another. And then at the end of the night, just like a regular speed dating idea, they pass it off. Kathy points out, Kathy, you beat me to it, your local SAME post is a great place for finding a mentor. Absolutely. You've already got that mutual love of engineering. That's a great starting point then to develop and further engage from there. The next thing I would encourage people to do is tell your mentoring stories. Part of our block on mentoring is that we're not always sure that we have permission to seek out mentoring. We're not always sure that we have permission to be a mentor. So tell people about your mentoring experiences and use the terms mentor and protege. If you're a mentor to somebody, say that you're their mentor. Call people your protege if they are your protege. Use that language because that gives permission then for other people to do the same. Especially important for the senior folks on here because your junior enlisted are looking to you as an example. They're looking to you to get a sense of what you see as permissible. So when you start talking about your mentoring experiences, about what your mentor did for you and about what you do for your proteges, it sends a powerful message to them that this is permissible and that it's a great thing for them and a useful thing for them. And finally, I would encourage you to educate yourself about mentoring best practices. None of us are born mentors. None of us are born proteges. All of us have things that we can learn. You've taken a great first step already by attending the webinar, so good for you, and thank you for being part of it. I will also shamelessly plug my own book at this point, The Army NCO's Guide to Mentoring. One thing that I want to make sure that everybody knows is I've made a digital version of this available through SAME. I believe, and Kathy will correct me if in the chat box if I've got it wrong, it should be available for download after this webinar in the same space where you can get your PDH certificates. She'll be posting it to the webpage, so it'll be on the Enlisted Community of Interest webpage. So by all means, please feel free to download that. Please feel free to share that book to anybody with a .mil address. Military, civilian, doesn't matter. If they've got a .mil address and you think that they would benefit from it, by all means, feel free to share it. This book was written on government time with government resources, so there's no violation of copyright or anything like that. For those of you who prefer your books dead tree, I totally understand. I'm starting to trend that way myself as I get older. There are hard copies available via Amazon. I do periodically get questions about signed copies. So I do sign copies one or two ways. You can either mail me a copy and I'll sign it and I'll send it back to you, and SAME can give your SAME can give the can give you the address. Or for folks who, the other option that I'll give is that if you're willing to buy 2 or 3 copies of the book on your own and give them to individuals that you think would be interested, let me know that you've done that, and I will send you a free signed copy to say thank you for doing that. Don's question on sharing to retired folks without a .mil address. Yeah, I know this is a blurry line. I have to have some place that I kind of differentiate it, and so .mil address is kind of where I've drawn the line. Certainly, though, if they're members of SAME and want to access it that way, by all means, they're certainly welcome to do so. If you want to get in touch with me, you can see my email address and my Twitter handle on there. I take direct messages on there. So I really look forward to hearing from you. And so at this point, I want to open the floor. At Kathy's point, anybody can access the Enlisted COI webpage, retirees as well. Fantastic, Kathy. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor to any additional questions or comments, and I greatly appreciate the engagement to this point. Thank you.
Kathy, are you on mute?
I'm on. It looks like nobody has any questions. All their questions were answered. Oh, here we go.
Oh, so from I've run a mentoring program through the marketing society I belong to. We set up speed dating style, let folks choose their top 3. It worked out very well, the best year yet. Yeah, I have found this to be a really effective technique. The only thing that I found that blocks people is describing it as speed dating. That seems to set people back a little bit. So I've typically advised people to call it as speed mentoring because that helps get people over that dating hump. But I agree, Ree, it is an enormously effective way to do it. And mentoring mixer, oh, I like that. Ree, I'm totally stealing that from you. That's fantastic.
So this is Amanda Jones. I just wanted to say thank you so much for kicking off our webinar series. Thank you for your presentation. It definitely hit home with me. I'm sorry I couldn't message on the chat board. Unfortunately, government computer does not allow that, nor does my cell phone. But I definitely do appreciate what you did for us, and that we'll have this recorded so we can share it with others in the future. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm going to allow Kathy to close out just because I have to go to a meeting. But I believe you're also doing future webinars for SAME for a few of the other communities of interest. So again, I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of the Enlisted community of interest. And I look forward to staying in touch with you and reading your book, because I did buy it off Amazon before I got the download. So thank you again.
Amanda, that's very kind. Thank you so much.
Yes, and if there are no other questions, yes, we do have another webinar by Colonel Kimball tomorrow that's going to be hosted by our Academy of Fellows. And we have the third webinar hosted by the Young Member Community of Interest on March 25th. All of these are at noon Eastern Standard Time. And then Colonel Kimball, after he's looked at all your questions and all your points and talked to all these different communities within SAME, he's going to be speaking to the fellows, young members, and enlisted at the AOF luncheon at JATC in Washington, D.C. And that event is on May 28th. So thank you again, Colonel Kimball, and we'll get this recording posted along with the PDH certificate and the link to your book.
Fantastic, Kathy. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.